Hi, I'm Holly Smith. I'm a student sustainability architect at the University of Leeds. I've helped set up and run the campus biodiversity monitoring project since the beginning of my undergraduate studies in environmental science, and that was at the end of 2018. So now I've progressed to project manager, and that's during my third and final year of study. And I'm here to talk about biodiversity, what it is, why it's important, and what myself and my university have been doing to protect it. So to begin, I thought I'd cover a little bit of history of the term biodiversity. So this is Thomas Lovejoy, and he's considered the godfather of biodiversity. He originally introduced the term to the scientific community in 1980, and from this point it began to be used very widely, very rapidly. However, the term was originally used far before this, so by J. Arthur Harris in his book, The Variable Desert, and shortly following Thomas Lovejoy's popularisation of the term biological diversity, Walter G. Rosen coined the contraction biodiversity, and then finally this appeared in publication in scientific literature in 1988. But what is biodiversity? So according to the UN Conference on Environment and Development, biodiversity is the variability among living organisms from all sources, including their inter alia, terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species and of ecosystems. Now, later there was a definition by Purvis and Hector, which is biodiversity is the sum total of all biotic variation from the level of genes to ecosystems. So all of these definitions are markedly similar, especially in that they are anchored in the notations of diversity, variety, and variability in different synonyms or different versions of the same word. Essentially, biodiversity is the name we give to the variety of all life on Earth, from bacteria to baboons, plants to people, and this range of life is really incredible. So all living things exist within their own communities or ecosystems. So this can be oceans, forests, deserts, ice caps, and even us living in cities. All of this put together is biodiversity, and the volume of life on Earth, as well as the different species that interact with each other and with the physical world around them. So the concept is broad and complex, but that complexity is what makes Earth a perfect place for humans to live. These diverse, thriving ecosystems may seem permanent features, but they're actually vulnerable to collapse. Jungles can easily become deserts, beautiful coral reefs can become lifeless rocks, even without cataclysmic events like volcanoes and asteroids. But it's really important to look into what makes one ecosystem strong and what makes another one weak. So, biodiversity itself comprises of these three key features that help strengthen ecosystems. You've got ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. These three pillars represent the diversity within species, between different species, and of the entirety of those ecosystems. The more intertwining between these features, the denser and more resilient this diversity can become. So for example, we can take somewhere like the Amazon rainforest, which is one of, if not the most biodiverse region of the Earth. It's made up of loads of connected ecosystems, and the range of species means that every link provides stability to the next. So this reinforces the genetic diversity, and the large variation in species genetics means that they are less susceptible to change. So if you've got a species that has lots of different genes that do lots of different things, if you've got a specific change that might unfortunately kill off some of the weaker ones, you've still got some with a stronger resilience to that specific change, and they'll pass those genetics down to the following generations. And so this can be loads of different changes that can cause these knock-on effects, things like diseases, climate change, and habitat fragmentation, which is the splitting apart of different habitats, generally by human interaction and land change. So when a specific species disappears, as I mentioned, a knot in this biodiversity safety net is weakened, and that begins to untie the knots. Although removing one species in an area like the rainforest wouldn't cause a widespread biological breakdown, there are some areas that either have lower diversity or what are called keystone species, which are really important species to that area, that if those get taken out of the web, it will risk overall diversity and a breakdown of biological genetics. So a species or an ecosystem we can discuss in regards to that would be coral reefs. So they are similarly a very biodiverse ecosystem on the planet, only really rivaled by rainforests, which we covered in the previous slide. So these ecosystems of species have lots of large amounts of different variety, and the coral reefs are actually these keystone species that I mentioned before. So the name suggests, it basically means that they are the important ones in that specific ecosystem, and their intricate structures mean that they create a home for many fish and invertebrates. Now, with those ones, when we have things like pollution, ocean acidification, and other detrimental effects to the corals, it can cause them to have a mass death, and that causes a breakdown of the entire ecosystem. Humans are woven into the biodiversity web as a whole, and so the loss of one species, even from a completely separate ecosystem, can have a knock-on effect to human well-being. Too many links lost can unfortunately risk unraveling the entire biodiversity net, and that is Earth's safety net. So, as I said, humans really rely on biodiversity to survive. We're intertwined in this big natural system, and each element supports and enables all of us to thrive. It is easy to see why humans need nature. We need fresh water, we need clean air, plants and animals for food, and many other services that these ecosystems provide. What we specifically need is this biodiversity. Nature around us isn't enough. We need a natural world that is complex, resilient, thriving, and full of variety. Nature needs to be able to cope with change. Different animals and plants in a habitat help to make the place stable and sustainable. Small changes will have fewer effects, allowing it to keep providing us with what we need. So these things that nature provides to us are called ecosystem services. So ecosystem services encompass a wide range of benefits, falling into 4 categories that can be seen in this figure. So you've got provisioning. This will be things like food, raw materials, medicine, and water. You've got regulating, so things that are naturally done for our benefit, that don't provide us anything physically that we can hold or see, but that give us the ability to live. So air quality regulation, water regulation, eroding of rocks and geological change, protection from climate change and climate regulation, and all of these other intertwined features. You've then got supporting things, so like nutrient cycling, photosynthesis, and soil formation, which are very basic but important, and then cultural. So these are the things that actually make us happy to live on the planet that we're on. So you've got the aesthetic values of nature, spiritual and religious, recreational, and so on. So UK biodiversity is really important as well. It's what we obviously want to focus on, being part of the UK. So the British Isles are home to an astounding variety of plants and animals. There are over 4,000 species of beetles alone, let alone other animals. So new species are being discovered and arriving here from overseas. And sadly, we don't actually have that good of an outlook on British wildlife. So we've brought a devastating state of affairs. Unfortunately, there's 56% of UK species declined between 1970 and 2013. That's a very short period of time to lose over half of the UK species in this country. So species and ecosystems in this country can be really fragile, and small changes can have large consequences. So the IUCN Red List is basically a world organisation that tries to conserve nature. So they've evolved to become the world's most comprehensive information source on the global conservation status of animals, fungi and plant species. Far more than a list of species and their status, it is a powerful tool to inform and catalyse action for biodiversity conservation and policy change. Critical to protecting the nature resources we need to survive, it provides information about range, population size, habitat and ecology, use and or trade, threats and conservation actions that will be helpful to inform us on necessary conservation decisions that we can make in the future. And this figure here shows the total number of species that the IUCN Red List has assessed. So we're at about 60,000. And then it shows the proportions of those that are of specific concern. So the colours and the indicators that were on that previous figure can be shown in more detail here. So it ranges from extinct, which is no species known to be remaining anywhere on the planet, to non-extinct, meaning safe and secure with an abundance of individuals and their population and of no concern to us. The ones in the middle are then broken down further to help understand the need for support and conservation efforts. So this ranges from extinct in the wild, so we can have species that are only alive in captive preservation. You've then got critically endangered, endangered and vulnerable, and those are the ones that we are interested in conserving. And then you've got near threatened and least concern. Near threatened can be important, but when something moves up to vulnerable is when we really need to start doing something. So in the short time that humans have been on the planet, we have increasingly disrupted the balance of biodiversity through, as I mentioned before, mainly changing of land use, as well as overexploitation of resources and the impact that we have on climate as a whole. We can see there are other primary drivers on this figure and the influences that they come from. If you want to take a minute to have a read on that, I think the most important ones that you want to really look at are climate change associated with global warming and habitat loss and pollution as well. So we are converting natural habitats into farms and factories, building roads and building up loads of different cities. So this causes a lot of habitat loss. It can affect the impact that we have. So areas that are more highly built up have higher levels of pollution. And then areas that are more built up actually have a greater impact on changing climate. So those all three of those can interlink and cause these really negative effects. So in the ocean, we're overfishing and drilling and mining. So that can be another one that is really, really detrimental. And animals and plants can only live in one small area of land. So ones that are unique, like butterflies or flowers that can only live in certain areas, they can locally go extinct if those areas' conditions are unfavourable to them. So animals and plants moving around the world are also big threats to biodiversity. When a new non-native species arrives in a new area, it is often called an alien species. Mostly this movement doesn't cause much of a problem. However, if that species causes harm to wildlife or humans, it is called an invasive alien species. Invasive species are often introduced through human activity, and this can either be deliberately or accidentally. And an example of this is rabbits in Australia. So they were brought to Australia by human colonisers in the 18th century to be bred for food. However, their population soon exploded and quickly caused devastation because of the huge number of plants that they ate. They massively impacted the world around them. Even now, rabbits in Australia can kill young orchards and cause serious erosion problems by eating trees and native plants. This story is echoed all over the world with loads of different introduction stories. So if you want to go away and have a look into ones in different countries, you'll be surprised by the diversity of which certain species have been introduced. And this is especially a big problem on islands where wildlife has evolved in isolation for millions of years. The ecosystems can therefore be more vulnerable to introduction of new plants and animals. So we'll move on to species decline, and this plot here is also from UN. So you've got the different categories of taxa of different species, and then it will show here the different degrees to which they are either of least concern in green, all the way down to extinct in the wild in purple on cycads, and then you've got the reds, oranges and yellows in between. So that can show the extent to which different species fall within these categories. And as you can see here, some of the groupings have much higher threats of extinction than others. And this can aid with indicating species that we need to further study and what solutions we can use to reduce these negative impacts. So we'll move on as well to endangered species and mass extinctions. So overall biodiversity loss can speed up extinctions, and 30,000 species are threatened with extinction, which is around 27% of all assessed species on Earth, which is a massive amount. We know that millions of species have already gone extinct over the long history of planet Earth. 99% of all organisms that have ever lived are now extinct, but extinction rates recently have been increasing. Species diversity in more than half of land ecosystems is now critically low. A 20% drop is widely considered the threshold at which biodiversity's contribution to ecosystem services is compromised. It's estimated that over a quarter of the Earth's land surface has already exceeded this, and so we really need to do something now. Earth's ecology is in a critical state, but we do have some tools to understand what is happening and what needs to be done. So our future rests on biodiversity shoulders within the Earth system, so we can no longer take it for granted. We are now in an era where humans have a huge impact on the planet's natural systems, and biodiversity loss is just as catastrophic as climate change. But the solutions are linked together. Stopping further damage to the planet requires big change, but we can do it if we act now and if we act together. More and more animals are facing an uncertain future. We know that millions of species have already gone extinct over the long history of Earth, as I mentioned, and biodiversity rates have always ebbed and flowed. So there are many scientists that argue we are living through the 6th mass extinction. So there have already been 5 in geological history, which were a long time ago, but there are scientists that argue we are about to go through or are going through the 6th. So we need to really look into what we can do and what can be done. And that moves us nicely into the Living Lab Biodiversity Monitoring Project. And this is what I'm working on at the University of Leeds. This has meant creating and developing and now running our biodiversity monitoring project on campus, using the university as a living testbed of species activity. Ours and related projects have also developed areas of the campus as living lab spaces to support biodiversity research and teaching. So one of these projects that's separate from mine, I'll just go into quickly, is the Sustainability Garden, or the Sustainable Garden, sorry. So it's an open space on campus for staff and students and visitors. It's a multifunctional space, so a place for quiet contemplation, sorry, I couldn't say that word, but also to cultivate an allotment forest style edible garden. So created in 2013, the Sustainable Garden won an award at the 2014 Leeds Architecture Awards, with the garden being an outstanding example of collaboration between departments within the university. And the garden is a great example of a functioning ecosystem with wildflower areas, soft fruit hedgerows, insect houses, and other pocket habitats. So we use this space to hold regular gardening sessions. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to run many of those since the COVID restrictions came into place. And these volunteers have been able to learn a wide variety of new and different skills. And then obviously we can have the food that can be picked at and enjoyed around the campus for everyone. So due to current restrictions, we're unable to organise these volunteer sessions, as I mentioned, but we are using this time to reflect on the way we manage the space and are reorganising the garden in the hope that we, once we can, we will open again and be able to host sessions for volunteers to get involved. So in the meantime, people have been able to continue to use the space in a socially distanced way. And another example of this is the Roger Stevens Pond on campus. So you can see a picture of it there. So after many months of research and planning, in autumn 2018, it underwent a transformation where development was made to turn it into a promoter of biodiversity and allow for scientific research and teaching. So we implemented floating islands of plants and sensors producing live data on water quality and then leading into impacts on biodiversity. So the project wanted to make sure that what we were doing on campus was properly informed by the research that the university has access to. And the problem we faced was that the pond is a piece of hard grey infrastructure, regularly formed algal blooms that required quite a lot of energy to clean and keep safe, and were aesthetically unappealing. So the solution was nature-based, one that will hopefully reduce management costs while also enhancing biodiversity on campus, and what is the only freshwater habitat on the main campus. So we're hoping that there's going to be some interesting data and teaching and research opportunities that come with the habitat as well. At the moment, we've got a PhD student who is a freshwater ecologist. They're employed through a Living Labs grant to be able to collect data. And while that might not be part of his PhD studies mainly, those data sets that are produced could become the basis for computer practicals in population ecology, or even build the basis for undergraduate dissertation projects or other modules that they'll study over their years with the university. So there's loads of potential, but we haven't yet been able to properly explore that. So moving on to the project that I'm heading up. So the project started as the Campus Pollinators Project. So the Living Lab, as I said, uses the world around us as a testbed to collect data, study key global issues at a local level, and foster sustainability throughout the University of Leeds. So the aim of this specific project is to collect data that will give insight into where the current pollinator hot and cold spots are, so where you're more likely to see more pollinators or less likely to see pollinators. And that will then inform the university's biodiversity action plan. So this is a set of goals and actions that we want to do to increase biodiversity on campus. And this is distributed amongst all of the staff that will do these specific things. So you've got our grounds teams that work in the outdoor spaces, as well as academics and other members of the staff team. So we're hoping to increase habitat suitability and connectivity to support these pollinator populations. And since then, we've actually expanded our methods to capture information on a wider range of species. So far expanding into birds, bats, hedgehogs, as well as other small mammals, and all of which can be used to understand the health of various ecosystems around campus. So we've changed it from Campus Pollinators Project to the Campus Biodiversity Project. And I'll just go into a bit of background on why we've chosen these species. So we initially decided to focus on pollinators because of the importance that they play in reproduction of plant species, with nearly 80% of plants relying on pollinators. Obviously, this also has a massive impact on food produced for our consumption. So that's another one of those ecosystem services I mentioned before. And pollinator numbers, unfortunately, are in decline. So they're one of the ones that will be under the threatened on the IUCN Red List. So because of this decline, the security of these ecosystem services of food production is being threatened, and research indicates that there is a really crucial role to be played in urban areas like the University of Leeds campus. So from there, we began to expand the work to cover more species, and one of the ones that are declining throughout the UK and has a key importance in urban areas is birds. So they have an essential role in the world's functioning, and they act as natural pest control. So they eat a lot of insects and control disease that they carry. They are also pollinators, so they can spread pollen, but they also eat a lot of seeds, and then they can excrete those and disperse them in different areas. And then the following on the birds in decline lists the percentage of those that are declining in the UK. So some of those are an extreme amount. 95% of tree sparrows alone, that's, you know, almost all of them are gone. So we really need to do something to try and conserve these. And urban landscapes provide a huge abundance of human-derived foods. So for wild populations, there will be bird feeders, and there'll also be food that we leave that goes uneaten. So they've got a really large amount of food that they can take in, and we want to be able to support them in other ways as well. So bats is another species we really are interested in, and it's due to most bats being prodigious insect hunters, similar to birds. They're capable of consuming an enormous amount of moths, flies, and mosquitoes. Evidence suggests that one bat may be able to eat hundreds of mosquitoes in a single night. And I don't know if you know, but mosquitoes are one of the biggest transmitters of deadly diseases to humans. So that's really, really important. So they eat types of mosquitoes that spread West Nile virus, Zika virus, malaria, and other deadly pathogens. But bats also provide huge economic benefits. In addition to controlling agriculture pests, they produce something called guano, which is used to make fertilizer. So bat numbers have actually fallen dramatically over the last 50 years as a result of habitat loss, destruction of different roost sites in the UK, and changes in our agricultural practice. So different methods used to cultivate food and to manage different farmlands has a massive impact. So that is reduced the number and diversity of their insect prey and therefore reduced their numbers. So it's estimated that the pipistrelle, which is our most common bat, declined 70% between 1978 and 1993. So the biggest threat to urban bats is loss of roost sites at houses and industrial sites, because they are being increasingly modernised, so you no longer have roof areas that they can hide in. And finally, we will cover hedgehogs. So these are indicator species for the health of the natural world. So because they feed on a lot of soil invertebrates, a big decline in hedgehogs implies the quality of the environment has significantly decreased. So they're an indicator of species health. And in 1995, the British population size was estimated at about 1.5 million. The current estimate is 66% lower, which is around 500,000. So that has dropped a massive amount. According to the Hedgehog Preservation Society, urban areas are of high importance to sustain hedgehog population numbers. So what can we do, and what have we been doing? We have been doing widespread monitoring and surveying on campus. So it's needed to examine progress of different species, report results of how our management is working, and so we can see what different changes are happening to biodiversity. So the way that we do this is by several different methods depending on the species. But with pollinators, we use transects, which are a 1 kilometre route that we walk, and we count how many pollinators we see, what species they are, where they're seen, the temperature, and all these other variables. We then conduct fit counts, which are flower insect timed counts, where we look at a flower for a certain number of minutes, normally 15 minutes, and then we count the number of times that different species land on that specific flower. In addition to the transects, which we also do for hedgehogs, with hedgehogs we use footprint tunnels, and then we also modify these slightly for bats and birds, but they follow more similarly to the pollinator route. The equipment that we use varies as well, but really fun for bats, we actually have bat detectors that we can connect to iPads or phones. And when they hear the frequency of the bat's sonar, they can actually tell you what species it is, which is really, really interesting. And I'm really excited to get to play with that equipment soon. And then just to give you a bit of information about the data that we're collecting. So the data collection has been going on for about 2 years, but unfortunately with COVID and with a lack of volunteers in our first year, we haven't been able to do that much data collection. So this is just some pilot data, so some false data of what it would look like once we collect more. So we are using this software called ArcGIS. You don't need to know anything about it. It's just the name of what it is. And we create this map of the transect. So this line here that you can see going around, that is the actual transect that we walked, taken on Strava, which is an app that you've probably heard of. It's used for running and walking and cycling. And then we have these base of hotspots. So these circles here are the different hotspots. Now, as we collect more data, we expect that there will be larger and larger dots appearing, and these hotspots will continue to grow until we isolate these really, really high density areas of abundance. We can then look into why they have higher numbers. So is it something to do with their direction, something to do with the flowers that are there, the soil, etc. And then we can try and recreate those areas everywhere so we can get more pollinators along this entire route and maybe even this entire field. So that's all I have to say today about biodiversity, but if you're interested, you can go on to the University of Leeds Sustainability webpage, or just speak to one of your teachers and I'm sure they can point you in the right direction. Thank you so much for listening, and this is the list of references of information that I brought into this talk. Thank you.